phone, but
That's where I do all my Twitter and Instagram on my phone.
Right.
Make sure I send you back.
yeah, yeah, right.
Yeah, not much.
So, okay.
We're good? You think we're good?
Let's just.
All right. Oh, I see two fingers crossed.
Remember what it was. Just one.
So basically.
Hi, everyone. We'll get started because Ron has a lot of great things to show us tonight. My name's Catherine Clark. I am the Adult Services Librarian here at McFarland Library, and I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I know it's hard to get motivated in the cold, so thank you so much for coming. I also want to mention, too, right now I'm starting a project where I'm trying to digitize some of the things that are in our local history room that the McFarland Historical Society has put together. So if anyone's interested or has materials that you think might or should be included in that, I'd love to talk to you after the program tonight. So please join me in welcoming Ron to the library.
Well, thanks, Catherine, and thank you, everyone, for coming out on a cold, wintry night. I appreciate it. I'm just going to give a really quick background on myself and why I'm here and why I'm interested in McFarland history. But besides being a lifelong resident of McFarland, I got involved in the McFarland Historical Society in 1985. I was on the board for 15 years. And one of the first things that I did while I was there, I created this walking tour guide. And there are 60 properties in McFarland that are in this book. And there are a couple of criteria that I used to have a property in here. And one was that it had to be built before 1930. And so there are some interesting properties since 1930, but I had to draw a line somewhere. And so from this, I wanted to make an awareness of historic preservation in the village. And a few years after this was published, I went to the village board and lobbied them to start a landmarks commission. And they agreed with that, and that was about 1990. And I stayed on the landmarks commission for about 10 years and then took a break, and now I've been back on it for about 8 years or so. But there are only of the 60 properties in the book, there are only 18 designated properties by the village that we consider historic landmarks. And so just because it's an old building, the village doesn't recognize it as a historic landmark. And back in 1990, there was a group of us who went around and looked at these 60 properties, and we decided which 18 should be designated as local historic properties based on the architectural significance and the historical significance. So that's why there are only 18, but we're open to looking at other properties as time goes on now. But anyway, with that, about 20 years ago, I thought it'd be interesting to have a walking tour around McFarland one summer on things that aren't here anymore, things that have been lost. And so I entitled it Lost McFarland. And I thought, just this past year, with several buildings being torn down, it brought to mind again my walking tour of Lost McFarland. So I thought I'd put together a PowerPoint and share it with you. And so that's what we're going to have a digital walking tour tonight. I think that'd be preferable than going outside and walking around. But the first thing, of course, should be the railroad in McFarland, because that's why we're here. The first depot was built in 1857. You can see it on the left there. This photo was taken in 1880 by Andreas Larson Dahl, quite the photographer of the late 19th century, a Norwegian immigrant. But the railroad came through here somewhat by accident. The Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad was going to build the line from Milwaukee to Madison, a straight east to west corridor. But there were some influential people in the Janesville area who said, no, we want the train to come down to us. And so when the train went from Milwaukee to Watertown, it diverted and went southwest to Janesville. And then to get back to Madison, they had to go northwest, and it came through this area. And so by 1852, they had built the tracks up to Stoughton from Janesville. And then so in 1853 and the first half of 1854, they built the tracks through this area. And a person who worked for the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad was William McFarland. And he was a carpenter for them, a supervisor. And he wanted to quit because he said he was the job took him away from his family too often. So that makes me think, well, maybe since he was a carpenter, maybe he was on this line as they were building it, helping to build the trestles and the whatnot. I really don't know. But the railroad didn't want him to quit. And so they hired him to come and put a depot up in this area because the railroad discovered that the distance from Stoughton to Madison was too long, and the farmers couldn't quite get to either site very easily, so they wanted another depot between Stoughton and Madison. So William McFarland came here and built this depot on the left in 1857. There was another depot earlier, about a mile down east along near Highway AB, in today's Highway AB. That didn't last, and so McFarland came and built this one. I just want to briefly mention in 1854, May 23rd, the first train came through this area, the first scheduled train. It was 32 cars with over 2,000 people on it. It was a celebration train, the first train from Milwaukee to Madison, and there were thousands and thousands of people in Madison welcoming this train in. So that was the first train that came through here. And luckily, that's one thing that hasn't been lost in McFarland is the tracks. And this is the depot many years later. In 1881, it was moved to behind the McFarland house because there was so much business at the depot, they needed a larger one. And so they built the second depot, but they kept the first one as a storage shed. And this probably was there for until the 1960s or so. But this is the second depot, and built in 1881. And we're looking to the northwest towards Madison. And I don't know for sure the date of this photo, but I'm guessing the late 1800s or the turn of the century, just based on the dress of the people. But one thing I want you to notice is the platform, because I'll mention that again later. But as you can see, there's not much around the depot. And this is what it looks like today from the very same spot. And now we turn around and we're looking in the opposite direction, looking east. And it's quite busy around the depot with trains on both sides, all three tracks. But the one thing that's lost in McFarland in this picture is the grain elevator over here, over by the lumber yard. But the Amy brothers ran the grain elevator as they ran also the lumber yard. And wheat was a big crop in the McFarland area in the 1860s and 1870s. And most farmers were growing wheat. And so they needed this grain elevator, wheat elevator to do their business. But because of bad economic times and the chinch bug that was devoured the wheat farming went downhill. And so a lot of the farmers turned to dairying because of the help of William Hord, who lived in the Jefferson, Fort Atkinson area, and he was a big proponent for dairy farming. And so most of the farmers in this area changed to dairy farming along with tobacco farming. So the grain elevator was lost. And this is the look from today. And just another look at the depot, and there you can see the first depot on the other side of the tracks, on the left side of the tracks. And as I mentioned, the platform, it was a wooden raised platform, and now here it's flat. It's kind of a small cinder rock type material. It's kind of an orangey color. And even today, if you go over by the tracks where the depot used to be, even now after putting in that parking lot, you can still see a few remnants of this gravel area right here. And I just wanted to throw this picture in too because I like the cow.
Who's cow?
I don't know whose cow. I'm guessing the McFarlands. And here we have another shot of the depot with the train coming from Madison. But in this picture, something that's been lost over the years has been the livery barn in these two buildings. And over here you can just see the start of the word livery. But it was built by Frank Sigelco probably in the late 1800s. And he sold it to John McFarland, who then used it. Anybody who wanted to go on a train could take their horses and the horse and buggy and leave them at the livery stable and go on their trip and come back, and there it'd be. And John McFarland also had a taxi service out of the livery stable, and people who came to McFarland and wanted to go somewhere, and especially in the early 1900s, wanted to go down to the lake, John would get in his buggy and taxi them down there. And that's it from today's view. And just another picture of the depot with a neat old car outside it. Again, looking at the first depot over here, it's getting in rough shape. But the thing that's lost in McFarland in this picture is this right here, the pile of coal that you don't see anymore. This photo is from 1958, taken by Roy McFarland. And in the 1950s, most homes are still being fueled by coal or oil. And it was, in 1958, still the majority of the homes were quite old. There were very few newer homes at that time because McFarland stayed pretty much the same from the early 1900s up through the 1950s. But then in 1962, the village installed natural gas throughout the community, and then a lot of the homes then were converted from coal or oil heat to natural gas. And so scenes like this disappeared in McFarland. And then passenger service also has disappeared. It's another thing that's been lost. And this is the Milwaukee Road Hiawatha train, and it would come through McFarland 4 times a day during the 1950s and 1960s. And you could catch the train around noon or a little after in McFarland and take it up to Madison for about a quarter or 50 cents. And it would take 15 minutes to get up there. And so you could get off, do shopping, or go to a movie on State Street, or go to a Badger game, football or basketball, and then take the 6 o'clock train home in time for dinner. So it was quite a wonderful service. But then after World War II, train usage dropped dramatically. People were using cars more, and then for long distance travel they would fly. But so the passenger train service suffered greatly. And so by the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the railroad knew McFarland wasn't a valuable stop anymore, so they tore down the depot in 1963. So there wasn't any agent available, but they had a little lean-to of some sort for a few years where you could take cover if it was raining. But then that went away as well. But the last passenger train service between Madison and Chicago was April 30th, 1971. And this is just an interesting shot of the rail corridor in McFarland. Here you have the first depot, the lumber yard, the Brixton Tobacco Warehouse, which I'll talk about in a bit, the Creamery, and then the hardware store, the Edwards Brothers hardware store, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And that's how it looks today. And then we'll switch to downtown. And this is an interesting photo. And I don't know the exact date, but I know it's between 1910 and 1922. And if there are any car experts out there, you can probably even narrow down the date more than I can because of these cars that are here. But this building, the Ed Reed building, which is now part of Spartan Pizza, was built around 1910. But the reason why I know it was before 1922 is because this building here burned down in 1922. And then this is the Thompson Autumn Garage, and that I think was built around 1913. But this was a Ford dealership in downtown McFarland. And I have all these cars parked outside, and they had two glass showroom windows on either side of a garage door. But now we're looking at an earlier photo of downtown McFarland, 1908. And something that's lost here are transportation. We have horse and buggies all over downtown. But it was soon after this that the cars started coming, and the horse and buggy disappeared. Then a 1920s photo of downtown McFarland. And again, here's the Thompson Autumn Garage. And the bank, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And over here, another building that's not there any longer is the Autumn House, but I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But a couple things that are lost are the ditch and the ruts in the road. So sometimes it's okay to lose some things. And this is a later photo between 1936 and the early 1940s. One reason is because you can tell, not only because of the cars probably, but this is Joe Hagen's groceries, and his store opened in 1936. But here again you can see the Thompson Autumn Garage with the windows. If this was after 1936, the Ford dealership had probably disbanded because Arnie Thompson had died, and then the business stopped. And so in 1936. And so this probably was sitting vacant at that time.
That looking straight north of the Amy House?
Yeah, that's the Amy House at the end. And then a little later photo of downtown, but this interesting thing really that we don't see any longer today is all of the trees in downtown McFarland. So that's also been lost. And I think I have another picture from 1958 with the trees. And of course, McFarland was hit by the Dutch elm disease, just like all the other communities, but also in 1962, when I mentioned they put in natural gas. They also put in sewer and curb and gutter that made a lot of the surviving trees have to be cut down. So this is the Johnson Scarry building, the one that burned down in 1922. Again, another photo that was taken in 1908. So there were a number of photos in this batch that were 1908. And so it makes me to think that there was some guy out there one day with a camera, just went and took different shots around town. But here, another horse and wagon outside the store. But the interesting thing about this store is just the peaks at the top. But it was a wood frame building, so it was it burned quickly, I'm sure, once it caught fire. This house over here also burned down. But on this photo, you can see over here that one building, the Ed Reed building, isn't there quite yet. So this photo was taken just before that building was constructed. Right now, this is where the left half of the Spartan Pizza building is. And this is the J.S. Johnson store. So I'm just looking around the audience, and so I can see that there are a number of people here who have lived here as long or longer than I have. And so you're very familiar with going to the J.S. Johnson store to buy groceries. This photo is probably I think it was the building was constructed in 1896. And so this was taken shortly after that. But the building on the left is the McFarland's first fire department or firehouse. And this is where the J.S. Johnson store stood, right where we're standing tonight. But here's another picture of the J.S. Johnson store, probably in the early 1960s. But this is one thing up here, a later edition. If there was a landmarks commission back then, this would not have been put on. But it's interesting to note that the people who had buildings built for them really liked to advertise it, because up here it says J.S. Johnson. And then the building across the street, which used to be the antique store, is the Ole Olson building, and his name is at the top as well. But then down here, I think it's hard to see it, but it's 1896 is when it was built. And George Dexter, which a lot of you probably remember, was the grocer from 1956 until 1964 in this building, and then he moved across the street for a few years. But then, before this was torn down, there was a pool hall in here for teenagers. But the reason why it was torn down, because McFarland State Bank wanted this property to build their new building. And this is the inside of the J.S. Johnson store when George Dexter was the grocer, and the bread aisle. And in the back here was a side door going out into Long Street. And there's a wooden floor, thin ceiling. And I remember as a little boy shopping there with my mom, and I'd get on my hands and knees, and there are knot holes that you could put your eye down there and look into the basement, which had a dirt floor. And this is the Autumn House. And I don't know a whole lot about this house, but I'm pretty sure it was built late 1890s or late 1800s, turn of the century. But I know that Olga and Rachel Autumn lived here for a while. But something tells me, and I don't know why it's kind of nagging at me, but I think the post office was here for a while. And one thing that makes me believe that is this cart. You can't really see it, but when I enlarged it and looked at it, it looked like a cart that they would wiggle down to the depot and meet the trains and load the cart up with mail and take it back to the post office. But this was torn down again by the McFarland State Bank. early on, they wanted to expand to the north. And this building is right now the Lofgren Dentist Building. When this picture was taken, it was the Toloff Lewis furniture and undertaking business, and he was also the barber. But he was a jack of all trades. But the bank was to the left of this building, so the bank originally wanted to go take this building and then expand out this way, so they tore this building down. But then their plans changed, and they went across the street and tore down the two buildings across the street. And then this lot sat empty for a while, but then the McFarland State Bank, I think, sold it to the Historical Society for $100 around 1970. And so this is where the museum stands today. But for historic preservation, the three worst offenders of historic preservation are hospitals, churches, and banks. And so in McFarland, the bank tore down quite a few buildings on its own. And here's the bank. And they also destroyed their own building by trying to modernize it in 1953. They took off all of this fine detail architectural work and made it look like a 1950s building with a nice redwood siding and whatnot. But they wanted to be modern. And a bank doesn't want to look old. So they covered this all up or took it down. Because right now, when you look at the buildings on either side of it, the fronts look pretty flush all the way across. And this part sticks out. And so I don't think that's there anymore. Or these nice details, they probably took it off before they put the paneling on. And just another look at the bank in comparison to the store next door, which used to be the antique store most recently. And it's interesting, the hitching post is for the horses. And again, another shot of the bank and the Autumn House. And then the bank in 1968 moved across the street, and then sometime later put up their electric sign, which was somewhat out of place in our little downtown, I think. But they wanted to be modern, like I said. And after a while, they put in a drive-up window. And then later in the 1970s, they put up a second one. So they had two bays for drive-up. But then, as we all know, they wanted to move out of downtown and go onto the highway. And then sold this property to the village to build the library. And so the next thing that's been lost in McFarland is the feed mill. And this was built sometime between 1896 and 1902, I think. And it was active until the 1960s. And here's a local farmer bringing his grain in to have it ground up. And here's the feed mill back here. This is a Memorial Day parade, and the Boy Scouts are crossing the tracks, and then the background is the feed mill. And this is actually a photocopy of a old photo I couldn't find, but I had a photocopy of it, so I digitized the photocopy. And so this is probably a very early shot of the feed mill. But what's interesting in this photo is, this house back here, it's very faint. And then these black dots, you can't tell in the photocopy, but you could really tell in the photo that these are evergreen trees. And so this is O.T. Olson's home, and he was the depot agent at the time. His house was built in 1890, and he put in all these little evergreens. And today, the house is known as the Robot House. And a lot of these trees are still there. They're very big. And so that's the interesting thing about that old photo. And this is the photo from today where the feed mill would be located. And here's some of the evergreen trees from the O.T. Olson house.
Back a couple photos when you show where the bank was. Yeah, on the other side where the drive-up was, wasn't Findorf had a big building there?
That was the Thompson Autumn Garage, right next to the J.S. Johnson store, where the Ford dealership was. And then when, for the last couple, 10, 15 years, Wisconsin Conservation Department was in there for a while, and then J.H. Findorf was there for a while.
And right behind that was sort of a shack that Smokey lived in, the old fire.
The second fire station was behind that. And the second fire station was torn down in 1960, and then they built the new fire station where the current municipal building is located. And so now we'll talk about the Badger Petroleum. And before I go any further, I just have to say I have to thank the McFarland Historical Society for the majority of these photos. They have a great collection of photos that they were allowed me to go in and copy them. So thanks Wes and Jane for that. And lots of other people here too. But yes, but I talked to you. But also some of the Badger Petroleum photos were loaned to me by Susan Saunders, who used to be Susan Larson, Arnold Larson's daughter. And so she sent me some photos of the Badger Petroleum. Some of these are from the McFarland Historical Society, though, like this one is. And this is Arnold Larson here. But he started Badger Petroleum in 1929 as just a little gas station on the corner of Farwell and Exchange Streets. And then it just started growing from there.
Is that Ruby next to it?
I'm not sure if that's Ruby or not, but maybe somebody else knows if that's Ruby. I would guess it is.
She
Yeah.
worked for him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so the Badger Petroleum just kept growing over the years, and he had a fleet of trucks, and then it became a regional business for south central Wisconsin, where he had a lot of properties that he operated. But his trucks would deliver oil all over south central Wisconsin.
Ron, you might just want to mention the tank cars in the background, the train cars, Phillips 66.
Yes.
That's how the product got
Yeah.
to Wisconsin. It was pre, underground pipeline days before the tank cars.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And so one of the side tracks, they would just park their oil cars here and offload it, as Tim said. And then here are some early versions of oil trucks. But then in 1936, there was a fire that destroyed the little gas station that was on the corner. And one of the items that Susan Saunders sent me was this clipping that said, McFarland saved as lightning set fire Mrs. Gas tanks. And so they think that most of McFarland could have been lost if the lightning had struck the gas tanks. So that's something. But the fire destroyed the gas station. And so instead of giving up, Arnold Larson built this fortress-like building on the corner of the street, and then here added the gas tanks as well.
Is that Farwell going on?
Yes, this is Farwell here, and then the exchange would go here. And here's the feed mill right next door to it.
Main Street, and then Exchange.
No, Exchange Street. Exchange Street goes all the way to this corner out here by the tavern. Exchange Street here, and then up here, right where we are now, Main Street starts. But like McFarland, the McFarland house, and the tavern have an Exchange Street address.
Is that where the gazebo, is that the corner of the
This is the site of the Arnold Larson Park, named after the owner of all of this. And so it just kept growing, and it was quite successful. It was the largest employer in McFarland with 100 employees. This is not a great shot, but standing on Exchange Street in front of Arnold and Ruby Larson's house, looking towards Badger Petroleum. And the company took up that whole block with all their buildings. And here are just a few more shots. Upgraded oil trucks from the previous picture. So they had Phillips 66. This is Conoco, and they were Gulf Oil for a while, and then also Sunoco.
Smith Oil.
And Smith Oil bought the company from Arnold Larson. And this is in the back of their complex. And here's the McFarland house over here. This little building was probably the livery stable and just converted. At some time, Badger Petroleum used this building for offices. And then it was a beauty salon at the last years of its existence. Here's Arnold Larson again. I don't know what the situation is with this, with all these men dressed up in suits, but I have this was also from Susan Saunders, this photo, but she didn't respond to me when I asked what this was about. But this guy here, I'm quite sure, is Roundy Coughlin, the sports columnist for the Wisconsin State Journal. And so I'm guessing, 1940s, 1950s possibly. They must have had some special event for regional managers or something, and maybe Roundy was the guest speaker. I'm not sure. And this is a 1958 Memorial Day parade. The parades would always start at Fireman's Park up by the grade school, and then they would march through town to the First Cemetery on Broadhead. And there's somebody in this picture who's in the crowd tonight, but I won't point him out because maybe he doesn't want to be pointed out. Yes. Yes. Yeah, Tim Mitchell.
Which one are you?
This is Tim right here. With his brother Bob.
Good looking back then. Oh, jeez.
But this shows, this is a common mistake to name this Main Street, but this portion is Exchange Street. But this is in the mid-1970s. And you can see this whole block is just Badger Petroleum, except for this area. And this was where the feed mill was, but the feed mill burned down in 1971. And so Arnold and Ruby built this metal building. And they had all these pine trees also on their property, and a few of them still are around. And I think Ruby and Arnold had a couple in front of their house for a long time, and a couple of them were actually up by Fireman's Park as well. And then you can see up here in the mid-1970s, they were just getting started with the construction of that shopping area where the hardware store is now.
The depot is gone in this place?
The depot is gone. This is 1971, yeah.
Shopping center went in 76.
Yeah. So this mid-1970s, they were,
That was there
yeah.
28 years.
And then this is near the end of the time for the Badger complex. And this,
Front there is where they used to drop off the newspapers,
okay.
right in that spot. My brothers and I, we delivered newspapers in McFarland for years. And that's where they dropped the bundles of newspapers off on Sunday mornings and
Yeah.
stuff.
And this, is the interchange for the four-way stop. But back then, it wasn't a four-way stop. It was two places had stop signs, because MN County Road, you didn't stop. They wouldn't put stop signs up there. And so it was really hard if you were coming from downtown, the little downtown, buying groceries, and you wanted to go straight up Exchange, you had to watch out because cars weren't stopping here. And that didn't change until the early 1980s. And so that was quite and if you're a kid riding a bicycle through this intersection, you held your breath. And the other thing too, while Badger Petroleum was in business, it made this intersection even more dangerous because they had a lot of trucks, not just oil trucks, but big tanker trucks that would go through here all the time. And that's today, Arnold Larson Park. And so besides that complex down on the four-way stop intersection, they had, Arnold Larson had 32 gas stations in the region and 5 restaurants. And he had a gas station and a restaurant in McFarland, down on the corner of Farwell and Highway 51. This is the truck stop, which is now Angelo's. And this is the gas station on the site of Culver's today. And truck stop was really a truck stop because this was built in 1959, and that was before the interstate went through. And so all the truck traffic came up 51. There was no interstate to use. And so if you'd go down to the truck stop for dinner some night, you'd find the place surrounded by semis and whatnot because it was the place truckers like to be.
Was it called Badger Restaurants back then?
Badger Restaurant, yeah.
And back when the Gulf Station that was there, you
Yeah.
pulled in, that was a full service station where you didn't get out of your car.
No.
They pumped your gas, they checked your oil, they washed your windshield.
Yeah, and I'm just remembering too that the cable people asked me to repeat what the audience members are saying because they're not picking it up on their audio. But yes, it was a full service station, no self-service back in those days. Someone would come out and wash your windshield besides putting gas in your car. And check the oil and probably check the air in your tires. But in this early picture of it, I don't think there was a garage at first, but then later on in subsequent years, there was a two-bay garage for mechanics. But this stayed a restaurant for under different hands for many, many years up until today. But the neat thing about this site was the architecture, I think. It was I don't know what the siding was, but it was like a metal siding, blue and white. And it matched the gas station and the restaurant. And Arnold Larson, if you think back to that fortress-like building, Arnold Larson did all of his architectural drawings, and that he was the architect for, and he had very unique, modern-looking buildings.
Is that Carol's dad?
Yes, yeah, Arnold Larson is Carol Larson's dad. So now we'll just jump down the street a little bit to Edwards Hardware Store. And so brothers Ed and Theodore started their hardware business in McFarland on this site in the 1890s. And it was a big hardware and farm implement business. And they had 3 buildings. These 2, and then there was one across the street, a little green office building. And I'll show a picture of that later. But there are hundreds of stories that people have about Edwards Hardware, and it was a very unique place. But early on in their business, they sold like 60 bicycles in a year or two, and like 300 buggies. It's just an amazing business that they had. But it continued into the 1970s with Theodore's son Roger, and everybody here who lived in McFarland at that time knew Roger, and he was the greatest person to help. And this is a really old, faded photo of the place. And here's the office building that was across the street. But at first it was 2 places were in this building. On the left was the office. This was the office door. And on the right was a door to the harness shop. And so there were 2 businesses there. And at one time there was a gas station here as well. And this building was torn down this past year, and of the 60 properties that are in this booklet, it's the first one that has been lost. And this is the picture of one of the original buildings of the hardware store. It had a Swedish steel roof, which was really quite unique. There's only one other building in town that has a metal roof. That's one of the houses on Broadhead Street. But this was taken off in 1990 when they took the roof off and added a second story. And the other building, along with this one, was torn down in the late 1970s.
What was the little addition for?
I'm not sure. Someone asked about this addition here and what it was for, but I don't know.
Easier access to the basement.
I think that's what it was.
Easier. The answer is
There was what he had there, but there was a basement below it,
okay.
and they had a lot of stuff there, but that was easier access for supplying it. So
Okay.
you didn't have to walk down a flight of stairs inside the building.
Okay, and so the answer is this was easier access to the downstairs. This picture was taken in 1985, long after, or about 8 years after the hardware business moved out of there. And so now we're at the Brixton Tobacco Warehouse, and this was built by tobacco merchant P.E. Brixton, who was also a farmer in the McFarland area. It was late 19th century when he built this, and tobacco was a huge crop in the McFarland area, starting in the 1870s all the way through to current times. And so the farmers just needed a place to come and sell their tobacco, and this was where they would come.
Where is that located? Was that located?
This is located near the lumberyard. This is Creamery Road at the curve. And yeah, right across from the Creamery and McFarland Dairy, and this is the lumberyard back here, and so it's just there. If you take this bicycle path that's there now, you'll see just a little evidence of the foundation that's kind of right next to the path.
You can't see it there, but on the back side of that was the railroad tracks.
Yes.
That came in, and Smith Oil or Badger Petroleum, Tim and I spent many years in there, but they would, railroad cars would come, and there was a thing where you would unload 55-gallon barrels of oil and antifreeze and God knows what else.
Yeah.
But we would have to go up there and work.
Okay, so they were saying that the tracks are back here, and box cars would come up with barrels of oil, because this was also used then in later years by Badger Petroleum or Smith Oil for storage. And just one interesting thing, too, about this history, the McFarland Lutheran Church held services here in 1896 after their church burned down and while the new one was being built. And some of you know of Benetta Dearson. She was baptized here. And then right across the street from the Brixton Tobacco Warehouse is the Creamery or the McFarland Dairy. It was basically started in the 1890s by the Edgerton Creamery Company and then eventually became the McFarland Dairy. The building still stands today, so that's not lost, but what's lost is the home delivery of milk, which a lot of us have experienced over the years. But on mornings like this morning, the milk would arrive a couple hours before you would wake up, and then when you go out to your front steps, then get the milk and pour it on your cereal, it came out as slush because it was half frozen. And the interesting thing about Hawthorne or the McFarland Dairy, they had glass bottles, and so that was their motto there. Quality can be seen through glass. So that was a thing of the past, but it was a kind of a romantic type of thing to get your milk in the morning right off your step. And the dairy, McFarland Dairy went out of, or the Hawthorne Melody took it over for a while in 1960s and early 1970s, but it stopped production in 1974. Now we'll switch to the schools. McFarland Grade School, this building was erected in 1918 on property owned by farmer Sher Johnson on the south side of town. And it replaced the school that was on the north side of town. And that probably caused a lot of consternation to some people who had to cross the tracks now to go to school. But this was quite the building. And it was expanded in 1939. Here's the original part right here, and then this part on the right was added in 1939, and a lot of the money came from Federal Public Works Administration. But then, after World War II, the population started growing a little bit, and the rural schools were consolidating, and Edwards Park kids wanted to come to McFarland, so they had to make more additions. And so this is the school that a lot of us are familiar with, and there were 3 additions made, 1952, 1954, and in 1956. 56 included this portion along with the gymnasium. And as you're all aware, this was just torn down last summer. And then in 1960, there was another addition on the north side of the school, this little 1-story wing. And here's the original bus stop with a curve in the street. And this is inside of that north wing. And for any of those who went to this school, this is the original tile, this gray and white tile. But of course, in those days, when it first was built, we didn't have carpeting. And everybody knows this, whoever went to that school. And so this is the red velvet or curtain, stage curtain. And so this was put up in 1956, and it was still standing as the walls were being torn down around it. They didn't take the curtain down before they were demolishing the building. It was still being hanging there while it was being torn down. And this is an interesting photo. This was taken in 1959 by David Sandell, who was a Capital Times photographer, and his assignment was to come out and take pictures of the new playground equipment behind the McFarland Grade School. And there are a couple people in the audience today who are in this photo, I'm happy to say. But yeah, a lot of familiar faces in that picture. This was taken in the 1970s, but again, if you were on that playground at all, you remember these monkey bars. And so you would never find today anywhere, not just in McFarland, but anywhere, playground equipment like that. But this is the McFarland's first school. That was built in 1882 and up by the Lutheran Church. But it was expanded in 1900, but for some reason they felt they needed a new school in 1918, and so the spring of 1918 was the last time that they had classes in here, and then it was converted to apartments. But in 1920, it was destroyed by a fire. And here's the original high school. Built in 1962. This photo is probably from 1974, 75, around that time period. The architecture of this school was quite unique, and it had a very sleek look to it, and inside the big wooden beams, varnished beams. This part back here, the second story, was a later addition in around 1965, 66. That was the junior high wing. And then there were more additions in the late 70s, early 80s. And then when they built the new school, the new high school, this portion was torn down as they did it in pieces as they kept school going through the whole year. And this is looking towards the east, up on the drumlin, the woods behind the school. And again, about 1974. But one other thing you can notice is just all the openness a short distance from the village. This is a poor photo, but this was taken from the window of the second-story hallway that went into the band room, looking out onto the tennis courts right here, and then the football field. The lights were installed in 1964, just in time for McFarland's first high school football championship team. And now we're going to Fireman's Park, which was dedicated in 1937, and it was north of the grade school. But a lot of things happened here. As you can see in this picture, it was the gathering place for Memorial Day parades. And the kids in the McFarland Color Guard. But also it was a baseball diamond. Back here you can see the bleachers and the backstop. And through there you can see the school. But the McFarland Home Talent played here up until the high school baseball field was constructed in 1962. But besides that, they also had their Saturday night doings here, probably in the 30s and 40s. They had, concession stands, and it was quite the event every week to come here and have fun. There was also a baseball diamond for Little League. This is 1966. The home talent team had already left, and so this was being used for Little League games, but it was probably one of the last games played on this diamond because the following year they were building the Conradelvium School, and that's what's here right now is the Conradelvium. And you can see just the cornfields right next to it.
There was a ball field even before that, though, because I played ball there in the early 60s, 50s, 60s.
Yeah, it was is this picture here. This is 1958, the ball field here, the bleachers. They had a big bleachers back here. And so the home talent played here probably from 1937 up until 1962.
Coached, they had some really great teams back in the late 40s.
Yeah.
49.
Yeah.
Snyder, the Eggman boys,
Yeah, and so it was mentioned that the home talent team played here, and Con Thompson was the manager. And they were the home talent champions, I think 40, 45, 46, and 46, or 46, 47, 48, something like that. And so now let's just skip to the churches, and this is the first McFarland Lutheran Church. It was built between 1869 and 1873. And in the background you can see the grain elevator that we mentioned earlier. And there are gravestones around the church because this church was located where the current cemetery is on Broadhead Street across from the Lutheran Church. And so like a lot of rural churches, the cemetery was built around the church. But this church was destroyed in 1881, but the story is that in the early 1880s, there were a group of people in McFarland who were Methodists, and they wanted a place to worship, and they were planning to build a church. But in the meantime, they came and asked the Lutheran pastor, Pastor Christian Wistendal, if they could use their church, the Lutheran church, for their worship. And it made sense because Pastor Wistendal didn't have services here every Sunday because he was in Stoughton as well. He went around to different churches. And so this church sat empty sometimes on Sunday morning, so the Methodists thought, well, maybe we can use it. But of course, being a strict Norwegian Lutheran in the 1880s, he was not going to allow a Methodist to come into his church. So he denied it. He said, no, you can't worship here. And a short time later, the church was destroyed by a tornado. Some say it was an act of God, but it could have been a coincidence. And so it wasn't a terrible destruction, so because they could gather the material that was on the first church that had been blown around in the cemetery and build the second church. So it isn't quite as ornate as the first one, but they used limited material. But again, it was in the same place in the middle of that cemetery. But in 1895, during a Christmas ceremony, of course, in the 1890s, they didn't have electricity, so they would put candles on the Christmas tree. And they blew the candles out, and the Christmas program was done, and they all went home. But one person was left to watch things to make sure the tree wouldn't catch on fire. Well, the story is that he heard a noise. It was dark, it was night, and he got frightened, so he went running out and left. And there was one candle that wasn't quite extinguished, and it caught fire and burned the church down. And so it was at that time then the congregation went to the Bricks and Tobacco Barn and had services there until the third church was built. This was built in 1896, and they wanted a bigger church, and so they realized they couldn't put it in the same footprint where the first two churches were because of the cemetery was confining them to that space. So they moved across the street and put up the third church. And in 1900, they put up the parsonage, and that's when they've had their first full-time minister at the McFarland Lutheran Church. And this is the interior of the old church, and it had stained glass windows and a pipe organ. But this was not original. When it was first built in 1896, it had a different altar area, didn't have a pipe organ, and this was added later, about in the 1930s. Same with the stained glass windows; they weren't original; they came later. And this is the well, I should say, before I get to this one, the third Lutheran church, the congregation thought they needed a more modern church, so they built the fourth church where the current church is standing, the current Lutheran church. And in 1975, the Lutheran church, the third Lutheran church, was burned in a controlled burn. But this is the Methodist church, and it was built in the 1880s. And but the congregation didn't hold together, and by the 1930s it disbanded. But this building still stands, but few people will know it because it doesn't look anything like this. It doesn't have this little steeple anymore, but it's on the corner of Broadhead and Main Street, the what is it, in the northeast corner, and it's apartment buildings. And in the 1940s it was converted to apartment buildings. And this is Larson's Beach, another building.
Can you go back and explain where that place is?
Yeah, the Methodist Church is an apartment building on the corner of Broadhead and Main. So the northeast
Kind of
corner.
from Thompson's garage.
Yes, yeah.
All right.
It's across from Thompson's garage. And so now to Larson's Beach. And this is one of the several buildings that have been torn down in the last year or two. But this was built, well, John Larson started the resort, and I'm not exactly sure when this building was built, but he started the resort in 1906. And Larson's Beach operated for 3 generations at this location. And then after the 3rd generation, it was sold, and it became the marina, and then the beach house. And so everybody knows Black Bridge, that it goes across the Yahara River on Exchange Street. And this was constructed in the late 1890s, and there was one clue to that, is it was one of those steel girders on the side, this one on the road side of it. Forged into this, the girder was Carnegie Steel Company, and Carnegie Steel was from 1892 to 1901, at which time Andrew Carnegie sold it to U.S. Steel and became the richest man the world. But so that makes me think that was built during the time of the Carnegie Steel era. And it was a one-lane bridge, and that's why I guess it was torn down, because it was one lane and not safe for school buses. And here's after it was painted silver, but we still called it Black Bridge.
It's called the Emma's Bridge.
The what?
Emma's Bridge.
Emma's Bridge.
Emma Egner lived in the Fireman Cross.
Okay, so it was said that this was also called Emma's Bridge because Emma Egner lived in this farm on the other side here.
Ron, my dad told me that 51 used to come through where Main Street is and came out and connect up before there was 51 where it is now.
Yeah.
Right.
It came right through the middle of town.
Right.
Came across that bridge.
Yeah, it was mentioned that Highway 51, before Highway 51 was built, the main road from Madison came down Marsh Road and turned onto Broadhead, and then on Main Street, and then continued straight onto Exchange Street and came out this way. Highway 51 was constructed in 1929, and that was a big controversy at that time. It took traffic away from downtown McFarland, and the business people weren't happy with that. But it bypassed McFarland, took a lot of the traffic away. But in 1929, what it did improve also was the traffic, the road traffic to the resorts on the lake. And another silver look. And McFarland's first water tower, built in 1959, in the same location behind the Indian Mound School, maybe just 10 yards away from where the current water tower is located. And this lasted until the early 1970s. And then I'll just quickly go through some of the open spaces that have been lost, and just see what McFarland used to look like. And so this is the third McFarland Lutheran Church. Here's Broadhead and the cemetery, but the cornfields came right down to the church. And then the photo was taken probably in the 1940s or early 1950s, because the church then built a new parsonage right here, and they expanded their parking lot. Then they built an education wing over here in 1962 and expanded the parking lot. And then the fourth church was built over here and attached to the education wing. But it's amazing to see all this farmland so close. This picture was taken from the location where the United Church of Christ is now located, looking towards town. Here's the tavern, the depot. This is the lumber yard here. And this is an aerial photo of McFarland from 1930. It was taken by Arthur Vingy, a Wisconsin State Journal photographer. They called him One Bulb Vingy because when he'd go on assignment, he would, in the cameras where you'd stick a bulb in the flash, he would take one shot and go. That was it. But here you can see McFarland is surrounded by farm field in 1930. Here's the Lutheran Church. Here's the lumber yard. This would become Fireman's Park down here. And here in the corner, here's the feed mill. And 1929 or 26, Arnold Larson started Badger Petroleum right here, and he had some tanks back here. But all around it was farmland. This is a photo from the 1950s. Another State Journal, Richard Vesey was the photographer. And so the tank farms are just under construction in this. And here's Sigelco Road, and then Marsh Road, and the Amy Woods. This is where Valley Drive would be right now. And 51 isn't even here, because 51 went where the tank farms are and what Terminal Drive is now. And it was probably in the late 1950s when 51, that portion of 51 was constructed. And this is a 1970s aerial shot of McFarland, probably in the mid 70s, because here's Dennis Drive and North Pass. It was just being constructed for this housing development. And this is what is Country Wood today, and all this has been developed. This is looking east towards the Johnson farm. I'm standing where the Lewis Park playground is today, and this is probably a late 1970s photo. And this is the Carroll Johnson farm looking east. And here's Johnson Street being constructed, so this is mid-1970s. The silo still stands without the top, but has a different top. It's a silo house on the corner of Dennis Drive and Johnson Street. And this is the Johnson farm looking towards Lower Mud Lake. And this is the Lanny Lane and Johnson Street intersection being worked on. This is the Carl Larson farm on the south side of town, probably in the mid-1990s. I think it's called Meredith Heights now. David Locke developed that area. And this is the other end of the Memorial Day Parade. In 1958, they would convene at the cemetery, but you can just see in the background all the space that was there. And this is today looking at it with the senior housing and all the trees and houses behind the trees. And this is the cemetery where the McFarland family plot is. Again, another photo by Andreas Larson, the Norwegian-American photographer. And this statue was supposed to be used at the state capitol for one of the fence post entryways, but they had a surplus of them, and so William McFarland somehow got his hands on one, and when his wife was buried, he put that at the grave. And that's how it looks today.
Both of his wives are there.
Yeah, both of his wives, but he got this for his first wife. And then this is taken near Lower Mud Lake, looking northeast towards the Willard Egner farm, and this is where Country Wood is today. And Creamery Road comes here and turns into Elvium Road. And speaking of Elvium Road, this is the Elvium barn, where the McFarland Dog Park parking lot is now located. And this is looking towards town, looking down Elvium Road. There's some houses here now, but it won't be long. I'm sure this open space will disappear as well. And thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it. But again, I want to thank Catherine and the library and the McFarland Historical Society and the McFarland Cable Channel for all the help and the logistics. And thank you for coming. And in a show of appreciation, I want you, as you leave, you can take a calendar, Wisconsin History Day by Day. Just grab one on your way out. And so thanks you.
Thanks very much, Ron.
Yeah, I'm glad you could come.
Really appreciate it.